I was out hunting in northern Ontario. No roads except for a logging road within 130 kilometres. I was late on the bear season, so no one was out hunting in my quadrant. I found a nice little campsite along the river and hunted from there. On the second day of my hunt, I came across bear tracks and I tracked it for about 2 hours, then turned round. This is when shit got fucking weird. I always track on one side of the tracks and return on the other. Around 200 metres down the east side of the tracks, I ran into another human footprint, which disappeared across the trail and into the woods on the west. My dog, Czech wolf dog, didn't seem to smell anything, so I returned to camp with minimal concern. I got back to camp around 7:30 at night, made a quick dinner, and had a cigar by the camp. At around 12, I heard a snap of a branch. After nearly hunting for 20 years, only two things snap branches: bears and humans. I grabbed my flashlight and a firearm and went outside after the noise. Every 100 yards, I would scan with the flashlight. My dog started to freak out, growling and then advancing into the woods slowly. I pulled back on the leash to slow his advance and switched on my flashlight. I saw a pair of eyes looking right back at me. It stared for about 5 seconds and then disappeared into the woods. On the walk back, I felt really anxious and scared and uncomfortable. I could feel someone watching me. The next night, the same thing happened. My dog went wild, like I had never seen him. He was whimpering, growling, and clearly very anxious. At this point, I was terrified. I didn't go hunting that day and didn't close my eyes once. That night, I sat up with my flashlight, constantly scanning the tree line. I guess I dozed off around 1 o'clock in the morning and woke up again at 3. I was sweating, really confused and very, very scared. I scanned the forest. Just barely visible about 25 yards in the forest, there was a man and his dog, and he was looking right back at me. I started to approach him, shouting to him. I got to within 10 feet. He looked awfully dishevelled and he really stank. The worst part was that he just stared and smiled. His eyes showed zero emotion. And then he whispered, "Good night." I ran back to my tent, packed it into my pack, and loaded it onto the trailer of the ATV, and then drove the hell out of there. My cousin was in a band and did some touring for a while. He ran into another band from the Illinois area that had a creepy story to tell. They spent their days on the road and didn't make a lot of money, so they always depended on fans to find places to stay. After playing a show, there was a particular fan who seemed really interested. He offered them a place to stay. His parents were really involved in their church and absent from the house. Their band members were kind of curious about this, so they asked him if his parents were on a mission. He just kind of awkwardly smiled and didn't answer the question. Later that night, the band members were getting hungry and thought about raiding the guy's fridge. However, they decided, since he was being such a good host, that they didn't want to be rude. They packed up the next day and then left. And a few days later, they saw a story on the news about a guy who had killed his parents, chopped them up, and popped them in the freezer. The guy who had been arrested under suspicion was the guy that they had stayed with, and his parents were in the freezer when they talked about raiding the freezer. This story was told to me by my great aunt, one of my grandmother's 9 sisters. In Cuba, where we're all from, the summers tend to get really hot. Coupled with the lack of air conditioning, because you'd have to be really wealthy to own a unit, people tended to sleep with their doors and windows open. One night, my auntie was putting her grandchildren to sleep. She laid in bed with them, and they were all alone in the home. One of her sisters, Berta, was supposed to be keeping them company tonight, but some last-minute event made her change her mind where she slept that night. My auntie says that sometime around 9 p.m, she noticed a figure who, by her description, must have been at least 7 feet tall. It was human-shaped, but seemed to float inside their home. If it had legs, then they weren't visible because of a long robe of some sort covering them, and dragged along her floor. At this point, rather than scream in fear, my auntie decides to lay perfectly still so not to wake the children. She sees the figure cross the hallway and then head into her room, looming ominously over them. The face she described was that of a pale woman with big red lips and her hair in dreads like that of a Rastafarian man. There were just shadows, cavities as she called it, where her eyes would have been. It left her room through the same way it entered, but didn't leave the house. My aunt's house is large, and she swears she saw the figure go in and out of each room, take about the same amount of time, and then leave. Eventually the figure ran out of places in the home to visit, and simply glided out the front door. My aunt cries to this very day because the next morning her sister Berta was found dead. Everyone thought it must have been some sort of heart attack or stroke in her sleep because no one heard anything, and they found her where she had laid the night before, only lifeless. My aunt swears the thing must have been death itself, searching for her sister where she should have been. This happened to me, and it still freaks me out when I'm home alone. When I was 16 a few summers ago, my parents went out for the day, and my sister left to go out too. I live in an average, small suburban neighbourhood. I was stuck in the house, bored with my dog, with nobody else home. It was really hot in the living room, so I turned on the air conditioner. For that to happen, I need to open the garage door, because the butt of the air conditioner faces in there, and the garage gets overheated. Usually when we do this, we lock the garage door that leads into the living room, but this one time I forgot. I sat down in my room and relaxed, not thinking much of it. Bad idea. A few hours later, in the afternoon, I hear my dog barking like a maniac. I almost ignored it, but went into the living room and heard the doorknob on the garage door jiggling. I assumed that my sister came home, so I yelled, "It's not locked!" She didn't respond. The doorknob jiggled more violently. I walked in and went to the door, yelling again, "It's not locked!" when the door opened. It felt like slow motion. The door creaked open, a sliver of a crack, and that's all I needed to see. I just saw feet. Huge, dark brown hiking boots of a man, not my sister. I immediately pushed the door to close it again and started screaming and crying hysterically. I'm a small girl, but I struggled to push it shut and locked it. He started pounding on the door and then it stopped. Hysterically crying and screaming, I scooped up my dog and ran into the kitchen to get a knife. When I went into the kitchen, I heard the gate in the backyard open and quick footsteps down the cement path. Like in the horror movies, with tears streaming down my face, I screamed, "No!" Dog in one hand, knife in the other, I threw the knife on the floor and ran to lock the back door. When I quickly bent down on the kitchen floor to pick up the knife, my legs were shaking from being so scared. My weak legs gave out and I fell forward almost onto my face. I tried to scramble to my feet but ended up crawling and tripping on the kitchen floor, and I accidentally scratched a long shallow cut on my bare foot with the knife. I hid under the dining room table and said my prayers. I thought this was it. This is how I'm going to die. Here in this quiet empty house with my dog as a witness. I held my hand over my mouth to cover me and stop me from being heard when I cried, as I heard the footsteps approach the back door. My heart was racing a million beats a minute, and I had the knife tightly clenched in my hand as I waited for him to make his next move. I saw his shadow through the blinds looking into the window. He stood there for a while, and then walked out. The police never found him. To this day, I always make sure the door is locked when the garage door is open. I don't know what would have happened if my dog didn't bark and alert me that there was a man trying to break in. I would have been in my room, completely unaware, until it was too late. My buddy told me this one just the other day. So his sister had 3 friends who went down to Mexico for a fun week of drinking and vacation fun. They were at a bar a night or so before they were supposed to leave, having a good time. And turns out their friend just up and disappeared. Her phone was unresponsive, and she had completely vanished from the bar. Well, they were all shit-faced at the time, so the 2 friends just assumed that she'd gone back to the hotel or had ended up with some hot guy or something somewhere. Turns out she wasn't at the hotel. After a lot of commotion, they were driving back towards the US when they are elated to see their friends sitting in a car with a few Mexican gentlemen, a lane or so beside them. Strangely, all efforts to contact her are in vain. They were waving, screaming, and making any kind of commotion, but it all ended up with absolutely zero response from her. They alert the border patrol that their friend who had been missing was spotted in a car along the highway. The border patrol stops the car and investigates. As it turns out, there was a pretty good reason why their friend wasn't acknowledging their presence. Because their friend was dead. But not only were they communicating with their friend's dead corpse, her organs had been completely removed from her body and she had been stuffed to the brim with drugs. Dead. Organs gone, stuffed with drugs. I was pretty fucked up after hearing that part to pry about what happened afterwards. But the image of her friends trying to communicate with their friend's dead body, their same friend that they'd just partied with the night before, chills me to the bone. My parents' house got hit by a tornado when I was in high school. You don't realise how fast those things are until you've been in that situation. We live in rural North Carolina, not exactly Tornado Alley, but we do get some bad storms now and again. My dad has this habit of liking to sit out and watch thunderstorms coming. We were all inside when we hear him yelling for us to come out. We walk out and the sky just looks surreal. There was a wall of black clouds sweeping towards our house at a disturbingly fast pace. When I say black, I don't mean like really dark grey or a steely blue. I mean black, jets of black. Like an ink cloud from a giant octopus was squirted into the sky. I've never seen it before in my life, not even on a video, and I hope never to see it again. So we were pretty freaked out by the clouds and the wind was picking up. I mean, those clouds were moving fast. Someone, I think my mum, said something to the effect of maybe we should get inside just to be safe. But things were starting to go crazy even before we turned round. The wind goes from 7 out of 10 on the windy scale to like a 25 in 3 seconds flat. We turned to get inside, and I'm the last to go in the door. I try to pull it closed behind me, but the wind is sucking the door open. I had to pull both hands on the knob and jerk back with my full body weight to get the door shut. At this point, it's probably been 45 seconds since my dad called us outside. We run to the hallway and start throwing things out of the closet under the stairs and climbing in. The whole house is full of this absolutely indescribable roaring noise. It was like a jet was taking off on our roof, or a train was driving through the living room. It wasn't so much the sound as a physical force. It made your head throb, it was so loud. You could feel it constantly in the pit of your stomach, like the boom from a loud bass speaker. But instead of having a beat, it was just constant. It felt like your eyeballs were quivering in your head. The pressure changes from the winds also screw with your sense of balance. I was getting that sense of vertigo you feel when you're standing at the top of a cliff and looking down. It was an absolute sensory overload. We all jump under the stairs and shut the door when we realise we left the dog out of the house. My mum opens the door and yells for the dog, which comes barreling into the closet like a bat out of hell. We shut the door, and at this point it's been maybe a minute and a half since we were all sitting in the kitchen chatting, and my dad yelled for us to come outside and look at these crazy clowns. That's how long it took to go from a normal evening to absolute terror. We sat under the stairs for maybe that much time again. 2 minutes, probably 3 at the most. It seemed like longer, of course. Everything was shaking. I just waited for the walls to tear apart around us or debris to start smashing through the door. Then the sound passed and we came out. The house was still standing around us. So far, so good. We go back out on the front porch and the door won't open. I give it a heave and push it open a few feet and squeeze out. The porch is destroyed. We had a small barn sitting in the front of our house and it had been absolutely obliterated. The tornado had picked up the barn, turned it into kindling and threw it at the house. The posts on the front porch were all destroyed and it was just covered with broken glass and nails, shattered 2x4s and pieces of particle board. Looking out over our pasture in front of the house, where we kept a horse and some cows, there were just masses of trees down everywhere. One stand of pines to the south of our house, and probably 2 or 3 acres of trees in total, were just gone. Our cars were pock-marked with hail damage. Our full-sized pontoon boat that we used for family trips up to the lake on the weekends had been picked up from the front yard, rotated 90 degrees, and deposited back in the yard about 50 yards away. Behind our house, a massive poplar tree was down over in the driveway, and had fallen just a few feet from the house. Yet other things remained weirdly untouched. One of our barns was destroyed, but the other, standing maybe 30 yards away, wasn't even missing a shingle. All in all, we were incredibly lucky. The house sustained major damage, despite its appearance though. The roof had to be replaced because the suction from the tornado made it unstable. In fact, to this day, you can still see the cracks in the walls in the corner of the top floor, where the tornado nearly sucked the roof off of the house. But we came out, none of us were hurt, and even slept in our own beds that night. So when I see stories like those of Oklahoma a few days ago, I always think back to those few minutes of terror, and think how lucky I was that those weren't my last moments, as they were for so many there. When I was a baby, my dad played on the softball team. Typical social team, out for beers and pizza afterwards with the guys. Family event type thing. My parents were good friends with 2 of the other couples, and both of them had young kids too. On this occasion, the other 2 couples had left their kids at one of their houses with a babysitter that they were splitting. They invited my parents back to the house to have some more beers that night, but I was being fussy, so my mum nixed the idea, though they would have 100% normally have gone back to hang out. Well, it turned out my fussiness on that day saved our lives. When the other parents got back to the house, they walked in on a home invasion. 2 men had broken in, tied up the kids and the babysitter and her boyfriend, and were waiting for the parents. Took the parents as hostage as well, and then made the dads drive them to the banks, where one dad was a manager, and clear out the accounts in the safe. Then they came back to the house and slaughtered both families, the babysitter and her boyfriend, and the kids included. They caught the 2 guys later on. My dad attended the trials and said it was the first time he had ever had thoughts of supporting the death penalty. It still gives me chills to know how close we were to getting killed that day, too. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go when they were teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded that they'd stop to let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out, and he and the other girl started walking the direction back to town while the other 3 sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed, and they hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact, and the only reason the 3rd survived is because they crashed in the front of the house that the 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralysed and lost his leg and part of his arm, and was in hospital for 8 months before dying. This was back in the 60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to the coroner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps, just thinking about how close he was to being in that truck. He said that the dad of the driver had gotten what remained of the truck to be hung up in the town centre for months afterwards, to be a warning to everyone else. I was on vacation in Ithaca with my boyfriend at the time. We had literally, I'm talking 10 minutes, just gotten into town and stopped at a suspension bridge near Cornell's campus. I'm terrified of heights, and so my boyfriend was coaxing me step by step over the bridge. It was gorgeous, and we stopped in the middle to take a picture. On the side we had come from, there was a parking lot with steps leading to the bottom of the gorge, but on the far right side, there were hiking paths with no barrier. A woman walked past us and offered to take a picture for us, but we declined, and she just smiled and walked off quickly to the far side of the bridge, where she then smoothly jumped off into the gorge. There was not 1 second of hesitation. It was almost like she expected the path to keep going. Like, the sound of a person hitting the ground from a jump like that just sticks with you. First, some backstory. I live in a small town in the south of Bulgaria. Almost nothing actually happens here. The most interesting things that happen here are the big fair at the beginning of autumn, the winemaking competition, and the celebrations in May. Our town is built between two rivers, and the winters are cold and foggy and very rainy. We don't really see much snow though. It's quite rare to see snow. At the end of November, the whole town was shocked by a terrible murder. At one of the rivers, 2 bodies were found. The terrifying thing is that the bodies were of children, and their internal organs were missing. The livers, kidneys, lungs. An ugly scene for sure. The whole town started gossiping. All the people said that they think this is the work of the organ traffickers. They were told of an unknown white van that was seen around the streets. They said that the license plate of the van was from the region R, which is typically known as Russia, especially in Eastern Europe. People who had witnessed the van also said that the windows were tinted darker than usual. Us kids was absolutely terrified at first, but after some time we even started joking about it. We called the van the White Ambulance, and we used to say, "The White Ambulance will catch you," or "Beware of the White Ambulance." But this case had us stop joking about it. So it was just around the same time of year that when our winter break had just started, so you can imagine our joy when at the first day of break we woke up to a heavy snowstorm. The snow didn't stop for 2 days. When it finally stopped, we went to a nearby forest to slide down one of the hills with 2 of my friends. That afternoon we had been invited to a birthday party from one of our classmates. We were really happy and cheerful, as we expected our classmates were too. The birthday was in a restaurant at the centre of town near the park. The birthday was awesome. We ate a lot of cake and chicken nuggets, had a big snowball fight, and built a snowman. When it reached around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it was pitch dark, but we still decided to stay out and play in the snow. When it got to about 6 o'clock, our parents started calling us back home, because it was really late, and it was below 0 degrees Celsius. Me and my 2 friends, the same 2 that I had been playing with all morning, decided to head home together because we all lived in the same neighbourhood. It was around a 10-minute walk, and we didn't want to go home quite yet, so we just dawdled and played in the snow, joking and walking slowly. When we were halfway to our neighbourhood, we heard an engine sound behind us. It was a white van. Our streets have almost no street lamps, and the few that we did have only shined an orange dull hue. The van stood at one of the dark spots of the street, and we continued on our way when we heard it again, and then we could see it again. It was a white van with dark windows, and we were so shocked and scared. We couldn't believe it. This couldn't be the real van that everyone had been talking about. We started walking a little bit faster, and then the van positioned himself only a few meters from us. We were absolutely terrified. Only a few moments later, we were running like the wind, using all of our strength, whirling ourselves forward. Our houses were so close, we managed to just make it there. When I got home, I locked the door and called my friends to be sure that they were okay, and looked out of the balcony. Then I saw the van passing our house. I looked really carefully, and I could see it. I will never forget it. I was 10 back then. Now I'm 18 years old, and I still remember the little R on the license plate. My family, mother, older brother and older sister, and I moved into our new home. At first, everything seemed great, and we were enjoying the new house and meeting the neighbours. But after a few weeks, I started noticing strange things happening. My mother raised us single-handedly, which meant my older sister had to babysit my brother and I when my mother would go out to work. At this time, my sister and I shared a bedroom. My brother would occasionally sleep in our room if he had a bad dream and didn't want to stay in his room by himself. One night, my sister was babysitting and had sent me and my brother to bed around 8 o'clock, but I couldn't fall asleep because I could hear my sister walking around downstairs whilst I was in bed. Not long after I was sent to bed, I could hear straight like heavy breathing. I looked around my dark room, but I couldn't see anyone. My sister hadn't come out to bed yet, and my brother wasn't in the room either. I hid under the covers, held my breath, and tried to listen to the sound again. This time, I could hear the breathing again, but it felt like it was closer. I was so scared, and I was getting really hot under the covers. I decided to try and run out of my room as quickly as I could. I threw my covers off of me really quickly, and I ran downstairs and I told my sister what had happened. She came upstairs with me and checked the room and under the beds, but we didn't find anything. She decided to go to bed too, so I ended up falling asleep that night a little better, knowing my sister was in the room. This was my first experience. few years ago, I moved into an older house in a decent neighbourhood with my 2 teenagers. We've all had experiences with paranormal activity in our previous homes, but we had hoped that this was all behind us. Our home is a 4-level split with a TV room in the basement. The TV room had a bit of a dark feeling to it, but we kind of thought that it was due to there being no windows. After about a year of settling in, my teenagers mentioned they are seeing ghosts. This wasn't a new phenomenon to us. We sometimes see shadows and dark figures in other people's homes, and I had seen them too, but I wasn't alarmed. We had just figured we had a bit of an extra sensory perception of things compared to other people. As the months drew on, the kids would hear sounds coming from the kitchen when there was no one there. No one was freaked out, as this had happened in our last home, and we would talk about it, and I would frequently smudge the house, and things would settle down for a bit. Over time, things would just go missing, like a pair of prescription glasses, or pens, or makeup, or less important items. Things seemed to go missing at night time. There were several times my teenagers would text me while I was out of the house, asking if I was home because they heard my voice or heard someone moving through the house. I experienced it a few times too, but I wouldn't text them. I'd just ask them the next day or whenever if they were home because I could hear them chatting or could hear the TV on. Each time, no other person was in the house. Then, after returning from a work trip across the country, I woke up the next day to retrieve a USB from my small purse. This USB contained important and highly confidential material, which I wasn't aware of until after I'd returned home, so I searched the small purse with only one zippered pocket inside to no avail. I searched everything, all my bags and my clothes, several times over a couple of days. Nothing. A few days later, I checked the small purse again, and there it was, the USB. I was freaked out a bit, but I let it pass. Surely I must have just missed it, but how? I don't know. A month or so later, I woke up to find a series of reddish stains on the wall in my dining room. Upon closer inspection, it appeared to be red wine, like someone had spilled wine that went from the ceiling down to the baseboards, but there were no stains on the floor. It appeared as though the point of contact went from the landing and then went up. I asked my teenagers about it, wondering if I'd spilled wine somehow but forgot, or if they had. They weren't really much for drinking, let alone red wine, and they did know that I wouldn't have been mad if, in fact, it had been them, because they were 18 by then anyway. I felt a bit pissed off thinking that something in the house had gone beyond playing games with us to trying to scare us. I have pictures of this on my old phone, I think. After doing some light reading into removing spirits from the home, I carried around a white candle in a glass holder and was speaking out loud to the spirit, if there was one, and finally demanded that they leave our home, or something like that. The glass holder that I was carrying shattered and the candle went out. I stopped talking and just threw the stuff out. Nothing much happened over the next little while. I went to the basement one day and looked around. The door to the TV room was closed. It had been filled with bedroom furniture, no couch. Somehow, behind the door, I saw a small boy lying face down on a sofa on the other side. I sensed that he felt sad and afraid. It occurred to me that if there were paranormal activity in my home, it might be from this lost boy. I talked to my teen about it, and we kind of agreed that this might be part of someone else's spirit who has not left here or something like that. Since then, we have still had paranormal experiences, but we've agreed to never speak about them in the house. We text or talk in the car. I think that if we feel fear or talk out loud about these things, it gives them energy. Anyhow, following this rule, things have been pretty good for a long time.